I have just finished reading the chapter and I have a few questions. First, I've heard of standardized testing and the curriculum, but this chapter seems to apply the term standardization much more broadly. Is that true?
Absolutely. As I described in more detail last week, it includes the standardization of knowledge. That is, treating knowledge as a kind of object that can be located, measured, manufactured, and transmitted to learners. The authors link this subjectification of knowledge to the conduit metaphor of knowledge. Knowledge is assumed to be in some sort of immaterial object that can be transmitted from the world or from other people's heads to learners. This in turn links to the standardization of learners. After all, if our heads are merely info containers, why wouldn't the same facts or ideas be stored in the same way? For example, why pay attention to individual differences in personal experiences and cultural background, etc.? Indeed, learners become categorized according to statistically normal individual development, with those who fall outside of the statistical norm being described as abnormal. In the mentalist classroom, the focus is on transmitting or delivering knowledge or information most efficiently to each student, regardless of the context of those students, the class, the community, and so on. In the behaviorist classroom, the focus is efficient, factory-like individual training, again with little consideration for diversity or group dynamics. In short, one begins to see education in terms of control. This is why there's such an emphasis on the teacher planning to move students to pre-stated outcomes, on managing students from above so that they conform to expected behaviors, and on measuring students' learning, for example, the mastery of facts and skills, in order to ensure proper products or outcomes.
Are the authors saying that standardized education is evil or wrong then?
No, Davis et al. Are not saying that standardization is necessarily evil or wrong in any absolute sense, or that other approaches are entirely right or good. Rather, they're saying that we need to be more aware of the assumptions that underlie our ideas about learning, teaching, and education. Standardization is just one approach, one that has been somewhat valuable. Historically, it has helped a lot of nations provide basic literacy and a better economy. In a purely practical sense, many basic things can be learned in a simplistic transmission sort of way. See, for example, all those brief YouTube instruction videos we use. But our culture has evolved a lot since then, and we arguably have better, more effective, and ethical ways to understand and support learning, ways that take into account learner diversity, classroom dynamics, critical thinking, and so on. So the question becomes, why should we stick with these old ways of doing education?
Has anyone ever done research on whether these standardized approaches actually work?
Yes, actually, researchers such as John Hattie have conducted a number of meta-studies. Meta-studies are studies of a large number of research studies that distill key themes from all of them. So a number of meta-studies of what works in education. These meta-studies have generally shown that standardized education isn't very effective, even when measured through the sorts of standardized evaluations that you would think it would have a home field advantage on. It's kind of ironic that when you examine standardized education with a very standardized traditional research approach, you learn that standardized approaches to education don't actually work that well. But that seems to be what happened. Here is what one very standardized traditionalist researcher, John Hattie, actually discovered to be the top 10 influences on student achievement. Number 1, self-reported grades. Number 2, Piagetian programs. Number 3, response to intervention. Number 4, teacher credibility. Number 5, formative evaluation. Number 6, micro-teaching. Number 7, classroom discussion. Number 8, interventions for learning disabled students. Number 9, teacher clarity. And number 10, feedback from the student to the teacher. It's worth noting that only the ninth one I mentioned, teacher clarity, is actually prescribed by standardized education. The rest really are better linked to other sorts of approaches.
Another topic that comes up in this chapter is learning styles. In the school where I work, teachers often have students take basic assessment tests. They determine which learning style they are to help them study better. I always thought that because it was so popular, learning styles must be true or at least supported by some kind of research. But in this chapter, the authors say that there is no empirical support whatsoever. What's with that?
Learning styles is just a pop theory, not too different from teaching students by their astrological signs. But like astrology, it's a very persistent myth. Of course, it doesn't get much respect in academia or research circles, but it seems to live on as an accepted truth everywhere else. I personally think that learning styles is not such a bad thing if it leads teachers to diversify their lesson plans away from traditional sit still and be quiet pedagogies. But once we start labeling kids or putting them in boxes and assuming that they'll always learn the best via a specific modality, whether it be visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or whatever, then learning styles really becomes a problem. I actually rant too much about the bogusness of the hugely popular concept of learning styles, so I will just refer you to one quick and accessible critique. Google "learning styles don't exist" and click on the 7-minute YouTube video that appears by Professor Daniel Willingham. Professor Willingham is definitely a traditional mentalist, assuming that learning should be framed in terms of information processing. So I don't agree with his root metaphor, but his criticism of learning styles is quite persuasive. That's it for this week. Hasta la vista, folks.